Good evening, everybody. My name is Sam Fankhauser. I'm director of the Grantham Research Institute here at the LSE. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this lecture and to welcome Professor Dasgupta back to the LSE, I suppose. Partha has a very distinguished CV, but one aspect of it is relatively simple, which is his main academic homes, and it reads PhD in Cambridge, and he's still in Cambridge. But in between, there's a crucial 14 years where he says he learned economics, where he was at the LSE, which was sort of in the 1970s and 1980s. So it's great, Partha, to have you back. It's great to have you talk about something that is very topical, sort of a long-standing topic, the question of how many people the Earth can support. When I say long-standing, most of you will remember at school you learned about Malthus, and Malthus is worried that population growth will lead to poverty. So that was in 1798. You can fast forward to this summer, where I read during my summer break an article, I think it was in the Independent, I don't quite remember which paper, which said that the environmentally most damaging thing you can do is having children. That was what that insight was, and I think the insight was that children are more damaging than flying around and eating meat, because children grow up to fly around and eat meat. I think that was that particular insight. But what you see from that anecdote is that we probably have to sort of apply the best brains that we have available to grapple with that problem of how many people the Earth can support. And Partha will be that person. He's thought about population since his PhD days. I think that's correct. But obviously has done a lot of other things as well. I think most people will say he is one of the most eminent environmental economists that we have. For me, he probably gets the vote for the most eminent environmental economist that we have. Basically, you can't do environmental economics or natural resource economics without reading his work. So it's not just the population part of his career, but also the natural resource economics, the environmental economics part of his career. And with those words of introduction, Partha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you, I'm not sure I know how far I should be off. Can you hear me at the back? Absolutely? Good. If I move around and you lose me, just shout, and I'll hear you. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back here. As Sam said, I grew up here, came as a lecturer, and then left for a variety of reasons, nothing to do with the LSE. It's more children and my own research interest changing somewhat. But this is my intellectual home, so it's lovely to be here. Now, I thought I'd talk on what I have been working on for the last year or so, re-entered a subject which has always interested me as an economist, particularly because nobody else works on it as an economist. Its population is not, demographic issues are not central to the economist's thinking. Certainly you won't have any demographic lectures in economics courses. And yet, of course, it's central to our lives. We are born into families and occasionally ask our parents, how come we are here? And many of us actually end up having children, and if you're lucky, have grandchildren, lucky in the sense of living long enough to see them. So it's part of our life, and it's part of pretty much everything else we do. It's related to everything else we do. And I'm an economic theorist by training and inclination, so I feel there must be a coherent way of thinking about these issues, these activities we engage in, and how they're related to one another, even although they manifest themselves very, very differently in different parts of the world. And the trick is to be able to find out, identify the reasons why the differences occur. And if you're environmentally minded, as I am, one of my first port of calls will be to look at the ecology of the place. Is it a river valley? Is it a mountain terrain? Is it a coastal zone? And then see whether the kinds of norms of behavior that they are enshrined in their communities make sense as solutions to resource allocation problems. So it's not an easy subject, but it's a compelling one. Now, at my age, sometimes I do ask, why have I done the kind of research I've done? And then, of course, you can rationalize it. It's always ex post. It's always possible to find a thread driving you. Most of it is cooked up, by the way. But nevertheless, if you feel it's satisfactory, you pursue it. In some sense, pretty much all I've done in the field of demography, environmental economics, and poverty studies has really been a response to the following dilemma that's very sharp now, but it was beginning to look important even when I was a young lecturer here at the LSE. But it's now very sharp. There's a puzzle. So on the one hand, I'm thinking now of the global economy. So don't think about England or the States or the third world or whatever. The global economy. On the one hand, we've never had it so good. And every 2-3 months, there is yet another book telling us we have never had it so good. If you compare today with, say, 1950, and I'll explain to you in a minute why 1950 is a momentous, it's time to anchor oneself. The life expectancy was about 45. Today, it's about 70, the global average. Everything I say now is global average. Today, I'm not taking a micro story at all. I want to look at the world as a whole. Per capita income, then, was about $3,000 international dollars at 2015 prices. So the prices I'll quote will be based on 2015. Today, it's 15,000. World population at that time was 2.5 billion. Today, it's 7.4 billion. Even as late as 1990, something like 40% of the world's population were below the World Bank's poverty line. Today, it's less than 10%. So pretty much all these global statistics look extremely good. And certainly, if you're intelligent enough and God asks you, I'll drop you onto Earth, you choose randomly, but you choose the time. My guess is you would say now. You wouldn't wish to be born in 1600 or 1200 AD or wherever, because the chance would be you would be toiling most of your life. So that's the good news. And it's a good news that we celebrate justifiably. I'm now ignoring distributional issues. I'm really looking at averages globally. That's the deal for this evening, okay? On the other hand, we're now living through what environmental scientists call the Anthropocene, and there's a reason for it, and I'm coming to it in a minute. At the turn of the century, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment put together the studies of 24 biomes, global ecosystems, and found 15 of them either degraded or beyond repair, or heading towards beyond repair. Last year in Science, the journal Science, a really remarkable paper was published by a international group of earth scientists who looked at time series of 11 biogeochemical signatures, mainly in ice cores and in rocks and in soil, to find that pretty much all of them had the most familiar hockey stick shape curve that you're familiar with in the context of carbon concentration. You're familiar, carbon was of course one of the signatures that they looked at, but they looked at many others, phosphorus, for example, nitrogen, and so forth. And in other words, over the long haul, the curve was pretty much flat, the deposits, that is, but took a rather sharp turn sometime about the middle of the last century, hence 1950 for me. And had very much the case, the setup of carbon. Now, of course, things had been growing before that. There was a momentum. We are aware of that. And we usually talk about the Industrial Revolution as being a turning point. But now we are looking at signatures which take time to establish themselves. Okay, these are feedback processes. So even although the driver started earlier, the signatures will be later. And about mid-20th century was that time. So much so that within months, the international group of geophysicists, many of whom are heads of the geological surveys of their countries, including ours here, signed a paper suggesting that the Anthropocene should be seen as having been entered into in 1950. That's just a focal point. That's not to be taken seriously. The whole idea is that it's really rather recent, that dramatic changes have taken place. There is one very large network of environmental scientists, the Global Footprint Network. The quantitative estimates are not of the greatest importance in a field which is lacking in funding. What's important is that they got the model right. They asked themselves they suggested that we look at the biosphere, the entire biosphere, as a gigantic renewable natural resource. And if we want to focus on a micro example of it, think of a garden pond. That too is a renewable natural resource. Mess around with it too much, and it will flip to a state which doesn't harbor the kinds of biota that you would like it to have. And then they asked the following question. What is the demand that humanity makes of it, and what is its capacity to supply? Okay? And I'll come back to their estimates later. But for the moment, you should know that they were suggesting that the ratio of demand to supply exceeds 1 and considerably greater than 1 now, but up until the mid-60s to early 70s, it was a bit under 1. So these are pointers that perhaps there is a puzzle here, which is that we at the same time are living at the best of times and potentially at the worst of times. And maybe our great successes, some of which have to do with advances in technology, of course, but many other things besides, which we economists have studied at great length, and so as have others, but that maybe that this success is built on the diminution of the natural environment, namely the biosphere. It's that puzzle that needs reconciling, which is the following. And the reconciliation, the question that is being asked here is the following. If we are so smart, how come we are borrowing from the future at such a rapid rate? And if we are, what are we doing to our children? So we are really talking about intergenerational distribution here. And the question is, if we are smart, and that's a reasonable assumption to make, we could always explain anything by saying we're stupid. But if you're smart, reasonably farsighted, and I have seen no private reason for believing that we are not farsighted, because we care about our children. And if we care about our children, if we are reasonably reasonable, we know that they will care about their children. And if you care about your children, then you care about your grandchildren by recursion. And you care about your great-grandchildren, again by recursion, because you know your grandchildren will care about their children, and so on. Now, no doubt there's myopia and so forth and so on, but the presumption that we don't care about our children we don't care about the next generation doesn't ring true to me. We do care about it. However, there's a problem. That's where I'm going to enter my economics hat, put my economics hat on. I care about my children, you care about your children, but it may be that you don't care about my children and I don't care about your children. Now, a good economist will immediately come up with a good price system, saying, well, prices will fix it up. But if prices are missing, some key prices are missing, then the fact that I don't care about your children and you don't care about my children might be a cause of some distortion. And the question is that distortion large or is it small? What are the consequences? Now, what I want to do is to build on this idea that there is a mismatch arising out of the fact that the signals that each of us receives within the institutions that we happen to inhabit are not sufficient to allow our private concerns about the next generation and the generation that follows to be aggregated in a way which makes the intergenerational distribution at the global level reasonable. That would be the sense in which the puzzle can be addressed, because at the same time we're doing very well, but there is a distortion arising out of the missing signals which lead us to overconsume at one level, perhaps overproduce. Now, I'm going to be very simple here. Nuances are not for this occasion. But I want to argue at the end of the day, when I look at some data and give you some theory to begin with, otherwise just data without theory is no data, or are no data, I suppose, that a sharp way of thinking about it will be to distinguish between those who there is a tension between consumption and reproduction. And I want to start with that thought. In a very famous paper of 1971, I think, Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren published in Science a paper in which they introduced an equation which is completely meaningless, bogus, and yet it's probably the most very, very profound, and I'll try and explain why. The equation is IPAT, I equals PAT, which is I is impact on the biosphere, R impact, humanity's impact, PAT is, P is population, A is affluence, I guess, for which read consumption, if you like, material stuff that we take. And T is technology, and they multiplied P with A and with T. No concern about dimensions, no concern about if it's a meaningful statement or not, but the reason I can smile at it is because I think it is a very serious piece of work. What they did was to argue that we should be looking at the impact we have on the environment, that is humanity, as writ large, and that nature responds to the demand we make of it. It doesn't respond to the rate of change in the demand we make of it, and it does not respond to the rate of change of demand we make of it. Now, you might think I'm being facetious here in talking about rates of change, but ask yourself how often you've read in the newspapers, oh, things are getting better, you know, the fertility rates are declining everywhere we look. Well, that's the first derivative you're looking at. That's the point I'm trying to make. Or that our demand for our emissions, the rate of growth of emissions is declining. That's a second derivative of emissions. But of course, what the atmosphere is concerned with is the amount of the flow of emissions, not the change. So it is a significant insight, and it was done in 1971, and I picked that up because, in a sense, it has influenced me in thinking about the problems that I'm discussing with you now. So we have this distortion. We want to ask why this impact is straining the biosphere with the result that the stock of the biosphere is being degraded, both quantitatively and qualitatively. I won't worry about the nature of the degradation. Some people would talk about depreciation, some degradation, some reduction in quantity, and that will depend on the nature of the resource. But for my purposes here, I'm aggregating, thinking of the biosphere as a gigantic renewable natural resource And if you want to have units, think of it as biomass. Each year it's churning out biomass, and each year we're converting the biomass, we're consuming the biomass and transforming it for our purposes. And the question really is there a balance of supply and demand in this dynamic system? Now, I began by saying that there is a mismatch. Now, what do I do to, there was something here which I could have used to, seems to have disappeared. Is there? Oh, thank you. What follows is based on a paper I've just published last month with my younger daughter, Aisha. And so those of you who want to look at the details of what I will be talking about, that's where it is, Population and Development Review. So what I've been really concerned with here, the mismatch that I've talked about, the tension, is the fact that certain important signals are missing. We call them institutional failure, if you like. And, of course, you can see that what I've been trying to get at is the presence of externalities. So I'm going to define externalities very simply. We are thinking about the unaccounted for consequences for others, including future people, of actions taken by one or more persons. Externalities are symptoms of institutional failure, which is why they cannot be eliminated without collective action. So you can now see where I'm heading, and I'm actually, in some sense, belaboring the obvious, but there are quite a number of young people here who may not be economists, so I want to carry the argument with you. So when I talked about parental concerns about children, but not necessarily across dynasties, that's what I mean. The externalities are picking that up. Okay? Now, why are there institutional failures, and why are there externalities? And one way of thinking about it would be to say there are the absence of appropriate property rights to goods and services. And the property rights need not be private. They could be communitarian. Communities fail as well. They could be public. Governments fail as well, not just markets. I want to think, and households fail as well. So we want to think about those ideas. But when externalities are adverse, the moral directives flowing from them can clash with the exercise of personal rights, and that's something I'll come to in a few minutes. Okay? But that's just a... Now, the question is, why are there these externalities? Why are the property rights missing? The environmental one is pretty straightforward, very profound, but very straightforward because we have actually been studying it for quite a while, economists that is. And one reason is, to cut to the chase, nature is always on the move. And you don't have a static. A bird which is in a cage is a different bird from one which can fly because the latter can pollinate and disperse seeds. The former can't. Likewise, insects fly, rivers flow, fish swim. And so, of course, property rights are very hard to establish. Monitoring is a difficult problem. So that's the easy bit. Those of you who are interested in game theory, you will recognize the externalities that arise out of these are like the prisoner's dilemma game. Reproductive, I want to talk about the other side of things. Remember the IPAT? Holding T constant, that is institutions and technology constant for the moment, IPAT equation is directing attention to per capita, the affluence of the average person multiplied by population. Okay? So now on the consumption side, I'm thinking of the environmental externalities I've just now mentioned. Okay? If there is a free good out there, you're going to not economize on its use. Entrepreneurs are not going to economize on their use either. So you can even see that the direction of technological change we have been witnessing over 250 years is really rapacious in the use of nature for a very good reason. Why would an entrepreneur develop technologies without any directives, in the absence of any directives, in economizing on what's free? They will economize on labor if it's becoming more expensive, capital if it's more expensive, and so forth. So the idea that technology will be there to help us, inevitably, is, I believe, profoundly misleading, because the direction of technological change is guided by the incentives that entrepreneurs have to making one invention rather than another. And if the signals they receive are wrong, and I'm giving you now reasons as to why they are wrong, there will be a bias in the direction of technology. This is not to say we can't be smart, but it is to say that we'll be smart in the wrong way if the signals are wrong. And I think one perhaps negative feature of our particular interest in climate change as a symptom of the environmental problem externalities that I've just now mentioned, of course, global climate change is a paradigm of this. One weakness in our excessive attention to it is that we believe, it makes us think that these problems have a natural technological solution, whether it's finding alternative technology, clean energy, and so forth. Whereas many of the problems that we face, in particular, species extinction, are not going to be helped by technological change per se, because causes of it has to do with habitat destruction. So the breakdown of IPAT into affluence and population suggests that I have to look on the one hand on the consumption side of the model, but on the other hand also the population side of it, which is what brings me to the mismatch when it comes to reproduction. Reproductive externalities, and one of the things that Aisha and I did in our paper was to put a lot of emphasis on Sub-Saharan Africa, because there it's a real outlier in terms of regional fertility rates. The total fertility rate in Sub-Saharan Africa is even today approximately 5. This is total fertility rate, as you know, is the number of children a woman going through her entire reproductive phase expects to have, surviving ones, by the way. So it doesn't include premature death, fetal death. So that's 5 in Sub-Saharan Africa. The global average is now about 2.5, 2.6. Even Bangladesh has pushed it down to about just over, but I may be wrong, I may be behind with over 2.1, which is the long-term replacement rate. So we spent some time looking at the anthropological literature to see what are the drivers for the high fertility that's being experienced in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I'll come back to it. I'll round all this up. I'm giving you now I'm going through the bases, so to speak. At the end, I'll put them together. One is cost sharing among the kinship. In Sub-Saharan Africa, and many parts of them, particularly in the central region, some 50 to 60% of the children have been found to not be living in their natal homes, but with others. Now, this is not adoption. It's something that's not exactly unfamiliar in my part of India, which is, gosh, I can't really look after my 4th child, says X to his brother, you take her. And it's not even a loan, and the brother can't say, no, I'm not going to take you. It happens, it's just fine. And it's nothing, it's rather sweet in some sense, and you might say that there is a kind of kinshipness in it, which is missing in this egotistical West. But of course, it does come with some cost, which is that is a free rider problem here. And so the private cost of having a child is less than the social cost because somebody proportionately is. So reciprocity, which is a wonderful thing, can come with some costs unless you're careful. Children as status goods. This was pointed out to me by several anthropologists, particularly at the refereeing stage of this paper. And that was a very powerful thing I hadn't really come across, which is you take pride in. I have 5 sons. The status goods, the moment they use the word status good, reminds me, of course, of Veblen. Veblen's account of consumption in the Gilded Age, which is to spend a lot of money to show you're better than your neighbor. That's like another PD game. The third, 2C, is the one which really interests me, and because it gives us some hope, some direct hope for population policies, which is that our preferences are also socially embedded. We are conformists as well as competitors. And here the desired number of children, in other words, the idea here is that how many children I have is not uninfluenced by how many children my neighbors have. And there is now a lovely set of empirical work testifying to this conformist inherentness in us in the fertility field. We know of it in consumption. There's tons of material on consumption and clothing. You just have to look around your neighbors and you can see how conformist we all are. I'm not wearing a dhoti, I'm wearing trousers. Why? I happen to be here. It will look odd, quite apart from the fact it's damn cold. But you see what I mean. Look around you and you'll see how our neighbors influence, our peer group influences us. And of course, we influence them too, so it's a mutual interaction. And so the idea here is, I'm going to go up now to the first of our graphs. So suppose you ask, and this is not a hypothetical thing, this is what the UN does all the time, the family planning programs are asking women in the reproductive age at time, what is their desired number of children. The questionnaires are extremely sophisticated. It drives the entire UN view on family planning. Now, in this diagram, which I hope you can see, on the horizontal axis, I have plotted TFR, that is to say the societies, the peer group, whoever the society in question. Now, I'll talk about what I mean by society in a minute, but for the moment, just imagine it's a village. So it's the average number of children per family in the village, and on the vertical axis is the desired number of children for a representative member of the family. And of course, I'm assuming here people are pretty much the same. Now, the fact that it's an increasing function, the curve is increasing, means that there is conformism. That is to say, you are being influenced. Your choice or your desire is influenced by the average around. But the fact that it's cutting the 45-degree line, OF, that's 45-degree line, in this case, in 3 points, means that you can get locked into one of several equilibria. An equilibrium will be one where the desire actually of the representative person is also the average. And since everybody is representative, if you're intersecting at the 45-degree line, then the desire is fulfilled. You're feeling comfortable about the number you have. You have 5 because everybody else has 5. And each of the others are saying, yes, that's 5 is the right number, that's my desire, and it's a comfortable situation because everybody else has 5. So the intersections are 3 in number. Those of you who know something about these social dynamics will know that the middle one is unstable, but the outer ones are stable. That is, B is stable and D is stable. Now, imagine that you're locked into D. Nobody has a unilateral incentive to deviate from what he or she or that household is doing, because it's an equilibrium in the sense it's the best response to the fact that everybody else is at D. But of course, it could be that they'll all be better off at B. But nobody will have an incentive to do that. So one of the things that family planning programs now are beginning to lay stress on, and rightly so too, is actually group discussions. It's not a question of just setting up clinics and saying, well, come if you wish to have contraceptives and so forth. It's not that. It's more collective engagement in the pros and cons of having children, bearing children at a particular age, and given the economic circumstance, spacing, and so forth. In other words, there is collective discussion. And I like to think that both Mauritius and Bangladesh have picked on that and made a success of their family planning programs. We're not talking about coercion here. We're really talking about social engagement over a matter in which there are externalities and therefore calls for social engagement. Okay? So, where am I? So, the last one, the conformist one, which I'm going to spend some time on, I have been spending some time on, because it seems to me to give us a hope for the future, has one implication, which is multiplicity of equilibria. I've just gone through it. Now, let me give you I said I'll say something about what I mean by society, because one has to be very open-minded about thinking. And one advantage of being an economist, particularly if you're a mathematical economist, is you lift yourself from specific instances. So what do I mean by society? Now, there's been a very, very interesting paper published some years ago, 9 years ago, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which went somewhat like this. The national government, parliament in India, sanctioned the introduction of cable TV into the country. Okay? This was sometime in the 60s, I guess, or 70s, I guess, or some such time. I can't remember the exact time, but it'll be the decade will be about the late 70s, probably. But, of course, being a federal nation, the states adopted it subsequently. But they didn't adopt it at the same time, the state parliaments, that is. They staggered it. Now, that staggering had nothing to do with fertility, right? It was a question of, nationalism. Do we want soap operas here? I mean, in our country, which is sort of, it's a country of the Mahabharata and so forth, infiltration of foreign influences. No doubt that kind of discussion went on, but it was staggered. Now, this paper tracked fertility across the states, 20 of them, 22, 23 of them, I guess, and found that fertility rate dropped after the introduction of cable TV and then flattened after a while. But of course, you could see now you have a staggered decline in fertility rates across the states. This is just one example. It's a very good one because it's a natural experiment. There's nothing funny about the method because the introduction of cable TV in the States was not guided by any motivation for fertility. But the fact is that one thought here is that you're open to your entire peer group might change through exposure. So when I say society, it could be the village, it could be your mother-in-law, for all you know, who insists on your bearing the 8th child because if you're having to be a woman. But it could be the state, it could be the world at large. But there are many other examples of this suggesting this multiplicity is important. Now, central plank of family planning programs is the idea of unmet need for modern contraceptives, which the UN derives from expressed desire for children, which is the percentage of women in age range 15 to 49 who are seeking to stop or delay childbearing but who are not currently using modern birth control methods. The problem is that the expressed number of children, expressed desire for children, is shot through with problems, particularly if you think conformist behavior is a potent force. Wanted fertility rate, which is related to the desired family size, is inferred from answers to the following question, and this is a quote from the UN program. If you go back to the time when you did not have any children and could choose exactly the number of children to have in your whole life, how many would that be? Notice the question says nothing about what others are doing. So if you take the conformist bit that I mentioned now, a few minutes ago, seriously, you would rephrase the question as follows. If you could go back to the time when you did not have any children and could choose exactly the number of children to have in your whole life, how many would that be, assuming everyone else in your community had n children over their whole life? And then, of course, you move n from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth, and see what the answer would be. Now, it's maybe a tricky thing to answer, but the fact is, it's tricky. Even the first question is hard to answer. In any event, that's what you need to do. So this has some potent policy implications. It has some intellectual consequences too. Economic demographers have regressed the total fertility rate on wanted fertility and found that 80 to 90% of cross-country differences in TFR are associated with differences in wanted fertility. That might suggest, see, if you hadn't listened to the previous few minutes, you might say, well, that shows people get what they want. So what's wrong with that? The trouble is that might suggest that high fertility is due entirely to strong desire for children. But 2C, that is to say the conformist point that I made, says that it is as true to say that TFR is high because the desire for many children is high as it is to say that the desire is high because the TFR is high. There's no causality here. The two are. So there are advantages of looking at these problems in analytically. But where it really hits you, or it hit me hard, being a liberal believer in human rights and so forth, which all of you do, we have a clash of rights here. these externalities that I started with over the environment, which take time and therefore in some sense the cost that's imposed by our free access to biospheric goods and services, means that the payment may be made in the future by people who are maybe not even born yet. Now, if you insist on women's reproductive rights, that is to say, the entire UN family planning projects are based on the idea of rights, and the immediate question is, why not? We have a clash of rights, because if you have if these rights are being exercised in the face of environmental and reproductive externalities, why then these rights are clashing with other rights? It's a fact. I mean, we know that rights often clash. You can't smoke in my presence because the law says so, but then that's a cost to you because you like to smoke. So we know that there are clashes, and usually we reconcile these clashes by giving priority to one set of rights over others. Here, it's a kind of issue that hasn't actually been discussed in the literature at all, so we don't even know how people feel about the clash of rights, particularly over the damages that the excessive demand on the biosphere affects the future. So I now come to the last 5-10 minutes to give you a sense of how many people can the biosphere support. I chose this topic in supporting comfort. I chose the title only to make it look weird, I guess. But there is a serious intent here. And in a way, I have to explain to my wife why I work on this kind of crazy kind of problem, because most of my colleagues don't. In fact, no colleague of mine works on demographic issues. But ask yourself, macroeconomists are constantly regressing one thing with another and trying to see what are the sources of economic growth. And they're looking at the output is GDP, or total production. And that's the connection I want to make with the question that I'm asking. As a first approximation, we might want to use our total income, or global output, as a surrogate for the demand we make on the biosphere. So that's approximation number one. There will be so many approximations that you'll be cringing by the end where I'm through. But I don't apologize, because nobody else is doing it. And if you think of, let me prime you with the following. If somebody asks you what the per capita GDP is in the United States, and the answer is from your colleague says, oh yes, I know what it is, it's 40,700 international dollars per year. And you say, how do you know? Well, he said, well, no, the World Bank has published that. And so that makes a fact. We believe it, and we believe it, and not unreasonably. Thousands and thousands of man-hours, person-hours have been spent in collecting data from all over the world, been refined for 70 years. This entire enterprise is now 70 years, at least 70 years old, of refining GDP estimates. What I'm doing here has not been done at all. So I have no embarrassment in giving you completely weird approximations. But I'm going to do it because somebody has to start doing it, and if it's one has to, the onus is on you, somebody else to tell me why I'm completely wrong. Okay? So my first approximation is that I'm going to use total output as, at least say, as the first approximation proportional to the impact. You might then say, oh no, that can't be right, because the poor have a different impact than the rich. Now you're doing so I could say, well, I can disaggregate. Fair enough, that's a good way of going about it. But then you say, no, but you're not disaggregating, so you can't get away with it. So then I'll say, all right, let's assume that it's an increasing function, but maybe a strictly concave function. Or maybe it's a convex function, I don't know. Either way, I'll have the tools. For this afternoon, I'm going to be using a linear one. Okay? And then if you want to have for discussion what happens if it's nonlinear, we can have a chat. And then I'll point to some more cruel dilemmas society would face if it's nonlinear, by the way. All right. Today, annual global output is about 110 trillion international dollars. This is PPP, okay, so this is the more sophisticated version of national income. global ecological footprint, the ratio of the global demand for ecological goods and services to the biosphere's capability to supply them, which is, I referred to it some time ago, is approximately 1.6. Now, that's a second approximation. That is, boy, this is, don't take this number as it's literally a ballpark figure. We know it's greater than 1 because otherwise it doesn't gel with all the other evidence that I sketched before you. If nothing else, climate change. Because remember, that's part of my ecological footprint. The capacity of the atmosphere, the biosphere, to absorb the carbon we're emitting. So in everything I do say here, and have been saying here, think of pollution as the negative of conservation. Then you can bring the whole lot together as one package. Because in polluting the atmosphere, you are, in a sense, not conserving the absorptive capacity of the resource, which is giving you the service of absorbing the stuff and then cleaning it up and recycling it and so forth. Okay? So it's 1.6. It's greater than 1. That seems now to be incontrovertible. And the hockey stick paper I talked about earlier suggests that the fact that it's greater than 1 is a reasonably recent phenomenon. Okay? It's trying to match different kinds of evidence that we have. So, third approximation, if sustainable global output at current compositions of output is as a crude approximation, 110 trillion divided by 1.6, that's $70 trillion, international dollars. And we'll come to institutional changes and so forth. This is I'm freezing the world at the moment and then seeing. Okay? Now, my old colleague, Lord Layard, who wrote a paper called On Happiness some years ago, a very fine book, suggested, and this is, again, to ask how many people can urge support in comfort, I need a notion of comfort. I need a benchmark. Now, there are two ways of going about it. I'll do the one I'm doing here today, only because the other route would take a long time to explain, but more importantly, it wouldn't convey the kind of urgency of the matter as this one does, which is, if you're an LSE PhD student or an undergraduate in economics even, you would say, well, why not optimize? Optimize over the world with choosing a number of people as well as standard of living and solve the entire optimization problem in one go, and you will get the right standard of living, average income. I'm avoiding that here. I have another paper where I've done that too, but this one, I'm going to take a reasonable standard of living, and if Lord Layard suggests it, who are we to question it? He suggested that $20,000 is a reasonable one, and here's why. Found that in particular one set of data set, these were based on questionnaires. These are happiness questionnaires and your life satisfaction questionnaires. So one set of global surveys on happiness and their relationship with household income, that in countries where per capita income is in excess of $20,000, additional income is not statistically related to greater reported happiness. I'm going to work with this without any questioning it, okay? Because I need some number, and because otherwise you can't even answer the question. And the right thing would be, of course, to take a whole sequence of notions of what constitutes reasonable comfort, and then work out the corresponding population. You can do that. That's sensitivity analysis. But here I don't want to do that. I just want to give you an example. So we work with that $20,000 international dollars at 2015 prices. And one reason I don't think it's an absurd way to think about it is that it was the per capita income in OECD countries in the mid-1970s. And it was the final years of the golden age of capitalism. And you might want to ask, those of you who are young, could ask your parents, were you a lot happier or unhappier then than you are now? I remember that period reasonably well. I can't say what the answer is, but that's the kind of question one needs to ask to see the reasonableness of these figures. But anyway, my point is not to sell you the number, it's to see what the implications are. And if we regard 20,000 international dollars as the desired standard of living for the average person, Remember, per capita income today is 15,000, so we are looking at a higher level here. Maximum sustainable rate comes to 3.5 billion, because you divide 70 trillion international dollars by this average to get the number. That was global population in the early 1970s. So we're not talking of unfamiliar figures. It was 2.5 billion in 1950. So if you telescope your history into the 65 or now 67-year period, you see a momentous change. If you use 50 as your starting point and end up in 2017, you see a momentous change in the success we've had and simultaneously the burden that we impose on the biosphere. Now, I warned you that what I want to do is to decompose the world into two groups, just to give us a sense of where we might think of hitting in terms of policy. One is rich versus poor, high consumption and high fertility. Remember, it's 20,000, just for the sake of argument, that's my benchmark. The US, the OECD countries are well in the high 30s, 30,000, high 30,000s. The US is, as I said, 40.7 thousand international dollars per capita. The poorest countries are, in Sub-Saharan Africa, I think it's just over 3,000 international dollars at the moment, per capita income in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, imagine that the 1.4 billion people in today's high-income countries were to reduce their average consumption from the current $40,700 to, sorry, the $40,700 was rich countries, not the US. US is even higher, to 20,000. That's a drop of 20,700 per person, and that brings the, and if it's over 1.4 billion people, that adds up to a saving of 31 trillion international dollars. So world income then would be $79 trillion, which is just above the 70 billion that we estimated as a sustainable income level or output or economic activity under current institutions and technologies. Now, I'm going to give you the final. This is from the United Nations. It gives you the projection of world population from 2015 to 2095. Okay. World population is projected, now it's of course it's 7.4 billion. It's expected to, the projection is going to be 11.2 billion at the end of the century. Of the approximately 4 billion increase during this period, 3 billion will be in Sub-Saharan Africa. So when I was giving you the TFR and the reasons I was looking at Sub-Saharan Africa, it wasn't just for the hell of it. It's because the future burden of demographic increase are going to be built there. Currently, population in Sub-Saharan Africa is just under 1 billion. So we're looking at a 3 billion increase from 1 to 4. Per capita income there is about 3,000 international dollars. Sustainable Development Goals, of course, rightly have a target for Sub-Saharan Africa well in excess. Now you can see, suppose just for the sake of argument, you feel that by the end of the century, it should hit today's per capita world income, that's 15. So that's an increase of about five-fold increase with a four-fold increase in population. And you can imagine the pressure on their ecology. It's a problem that they will be facing. That's the most important thing. That's the first thing. The second thing is, at the moment, Sub-Saharan Africa is only 13% of the global GDP. So they cannot be remotely blamed for the problems that we've been discussing here, the environmental problems. They're tiny. They have lots of ecological problems within the region. That's for sure. The local environment is in a bad way. But that's a different matter. They certainly cannot be held responsible for carbon concentration and so forth because they're tiny. So it's the high consumption at this end of the world and high fertility at that end of the world which looks to be ominous for the next 60 years or so. That's 60, 70, 80 years or so. That seems to be what this the data are telling us. And what I've tried to do in this lecture is to give you an analytical basis for thinking about the fact that we are both at the best of times and at the worst of times. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Partha. I'm always fascinated by people who can express something unbelievably complicated with a few numbers. So that's really, really impressive. We have time for quite a few questions, and I'm sure there will be many. You know the rules. Wait until you have a microphone. Introduce yourself, and as you wish. And then a question is a statement that takes less than a minute or even half a minute to express. Okay, who wants to go first? Let's start on the left here. And maybe we collect those two together. And go ahead.
Hi, Jim Clark. Thanks for your talk. You mentioned that we are over twice what you would say is a good level for the population to be. Is there any liberal way to slow or even reverse population growth?
Okay, let's just move down the bench a little bit.
I think I'll take that question immediately because that's a very important.
Let's do one at a time.
Well, just this once anyway. Let's get going. It's a very important one because it's the moment you say population, you mean population control, and then you lose the thread of what's going on here. I think there are some. It's easy to say that I know how to do it. I don't. Absolutely no clue. But the conformist is suggesting something very liberal, and it's been tried and it's been successful, at least in some countries, which is collective discussion. It's in a sense giving back the rights to women. So you see, one of the problems in the UN thing, which I didn't really go into in our paper with Aisha goes into it in some detail, is that you are at the same time looking to unearth women's reproductive needs. And you're trying to find that or unearth that through their expressed desires. Now, the gap between a desire and a need is huge in a world in which there is huge gender inequalities. And I needn't belabor the point, it's pretty obvious. Just asking a woman what your desired number, family size is not going to give you much sense of it. And particularly if you think that family planning programs are there to help with attaining the desires, then if you're in Niger and your answer is 9, and they're currently at 7, which is the case, presumably the UN should be helping them to have 2 more. And that doesn't seem right, feel right. And the reason it doesn't feel right is the answer, a desire is very different from need, and it's need that we should be concerned with. And you've got a huge gender inequality issues all over the world, but in particular in poor countries. So I think the conformist side is pretty straight. It's very, very important, and until we make use of it, and it's a very liberal agenda because you're essentially trying to get people to talk to each other. Nothing more. And then we're there to help if you, like the Grameen Bank was one of those where the conversations were very helpful in getting women to at least enter the marketplace of savings and investment. It comes to my allusion to the rich, I think in the case of overconsumption, I think there's no question. We should be thinking in taxation of the resources that we are being using. So when people talk about carbon tax, that's exactly what they're talking about. But it goes all over the world. I mean, that's to say the leakage in terms of externalities is just enormous. And the fact that it hasn't been really studied is a negative feature of my discipline. Externalities, even now, barring climate change, is seen as an exception. You prove that there's an externality before I think that there is a case for a public collective action. That's the wrong way around. I would now say, you prove to me that there aren't any, and why we shouldn't be thinking about what might be the sources of the externalities. And these are adverse externalities, remember, the environmental ones. trashing the Amazon, trashing the oceans, because they're cheap. And here the technological change is very interesting and important. The biases I mentioned, that they're rapacious, is proven by the fact that we have chainsaws, which are extremely good things because they save on energy, human energy. So a person can cut, a group can cut through forests at a faster pace than they could 200 years ago. It's transformed logging, right? But of course, it has simultaneously created another problem, the fact that the ecosystem protection that forests provide is not being counted for. And nobody was interested in counting it when devising these. Likewise with fisheries, with the ways you can now track schools of fish and then just wipe out entire schools plus the ecosystem in which they're harboring. Those are the unintended effects of the technology. So the technological solution to these problems seem to me to be remote. It has to be, in my judgment, for these problems, it has to be institutional. In this case, naturally, taxation would be the right thing over consumption. I would not think of taxation of families because the burden is amongst the poor, and there you want to help them to reach a collective decision which will be lower than they currently are. It's not going to happen in the West over consumption because their enlightened people say, well, I'm not going to use plastic, I'm going to now become a vegan and so forth. But we're looking at minuscule population proportions. It's not a movement of it. It needs some state directive, international directives in this case, because these are global resources. So again, you have the prisoner's dilemma problem at the national level now, as opposed to. Okay, that's the best I can do.
Okay, let's next question.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the talk. It's an interesting coincidence, is it not, that the rise of the machines of artificial intelligence suddenly coincides with the fact that there maybe are too many humans. And interesting again that it's kind of framed in a kind of moral way, that you have to, that somehow you're morally culpable for your footprint, when the issue might be more to do with how machines are having an effect on our lives rather than necessarily what humans are doing.
I'm sorry, I think I lost
So it's an interesting coincidence that the rise of machines, the fact that there are more machines, more artificial intelligence, more computers, more machines doing things that humans used to do. It's an interesting coincidence that that coincides somehow with the fact that suddenly we're realizing that there might be too many humans and that we might be consuming too much.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I wouldn't know how to think about it. I haven't appreciated. Notice I've been avoiding two sets of expressions. I haven't at all talked of morality here. It's self-interest or collective interest is what I've been harmed. And the other is, I guess, the direction in which our activities are, the direction in which technological change occurs, other than the fact that there are going to be labor-saving, as opposed to economizing on nature. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question here right in the middle.
David Flint, the Green Party. I'm glad you mentioned carbon tax because I've been working on carbon tax. If carbon tax is imposed to cover the externalities, should the revenue from the carbon tax be used to compensate people for the damage that the externalities express or to stop that damage occurring? Or should it be used for some other purpose?
Sorry, you want to move the target from carbon to what?
If carbon tax is set, and other resource taxes are set, in terms of the externalities that the resource consumption, like air pollution, damage and climate change, then the revenue raised from that tax, should it be used to prevent or compensate those particular harms?
Very nice question. Yes, of course. Back in the 70s, there was a small literature suggesting that these taxes from these global commons could be used for redistribution purpose from the rich to the poor countries. That was there's a large literature. I think in the mid-70s, development economists felt, they even tried to estimate, just as I'm doing here, crude numbers about the revenue that the international bodies could collect on, at that time it wasn't carbon, it was manganese nodules in the bottom of the ocean seabed. And there was a movement to try and to mine them. It hasn't really worked. The technology apparently is very difficult, largely because it's probably not economic. There were other things, better things for entrepreneurs to do. But the answer is yes, of course. Typically, you would do that. You would wish to compensate. But the compensation is not actually necessary, because the fact is, if you've imposed the tax, then the damage won't occur. That's the whole idea, right? Because you've taken that damage into account. So you want to use it for many other things besides. There are plenty of other things to do with money. I mean, I have no idea what a global environmental tax would even look like in terms of the revenue. I don't think anybody has tried to do that. Carbon, they have, of course. But there may be studies there which I haven't seen.
Okay, where shall we go next? We haven't. Let's go over there. Just an observation. I only see male hands, so the ladies perhaps should think of a question.
Hi, my name is Lutz. I'm a PhD student here. Thanks for the talk. So my question is about what's desirable and what's feasible. So I was wondering if you have a stance on population ethics, in the sense of, is it more desirable to have a population of 3.5 billion people with $20,000 of living standard, or rather 14 billion with 5,000? And then also what's feasible to achieve? Because I feel like we have a fairly good idea what policies can lead to lower fertility rates in Africa at some point. Do you have an idea how we can get the Europeans or the Americans to consume less as well?
No, that's a bit unfair. I really am not a policy expert at all. As a first cut, I have essentially avoided distributional matters here. And because it's not clear to me how, the analysis is, the quantitative analysis is so crude that it's hard to know whether it makes any sense to decompose it. There are enough problems within it anyway. That's to say, what the direction which is mentioning. I can't help thinking there is look, these are collective endeavors. If you're studying a village, if you're an anthropologist to study a village or a cluster of villages, then the policies that strike you would be to get collective decision made or collective discussion going within the community. And that's where the anthropologists are so rich in their writings. When it comes to nations, the units now are nations. You really are, look at, it's taken dozens of years to get to Paris, and that's only with one distortion, as it were. Over the oceans, it'll be another 50 years before the oceans get a look in. Meanwhile, we're trashing that in very many ways. Its absorptive capacity for heat is now weakened enormously. Plus, on top of that, we are dumping material in it. We are removing bottom layers of the oceans in our activities. So it's being insulted in many ways, and it's nowhere near an international consciousness. So I said it's an unfair question. It is, but on the other hand, that needs to be asked. So do keep. It seems to me that the reason I talk about this kind of problem is, I think we, as citizens, we need to really work at it. That's the liberal solution that you were asking for, but I can't think of any other. It's not going to come from some directive, because there's nobody to give the directive. And it has to come from the next generation, because my generation is basically screwed yours. And you're going to do that to the next one, by the way.
Okay, where do we go next? far up. We haven't been to the back benches, so make the people with the microphone walk a little bit. Yeah, gentleman with the blue jumper. Maybe let's sort of stay in that neighborhood a little bit.
Hello, my name is Keith Hindle. And I was very disappointed by your lecture because you didn't answer the question. You're sailing under false pretenses. Right? So please don't entitle in future lectures until you've got the answer. But when you were asked for what are the solutions, you tentatively talked about contraception, but you didn't mention abortion. Now, abortion is part of the solution. In all the Western countries with liberal abortion laws, their population has become stable or even reduced. So why don't you put that into your calculation?
Right. Thank you very much for asking. I did answer the question.
Okay, let him answer the question.
But I would, I believe, again, you like this young man, being unfair. Because I think I answered the question. I didn't say how do we get to the population that the Earth can support in reasonable comfort. I asked how many people can Earth support in comfort, reasonable comfort, or comfort. The policy is where I really am weak. It's not my strength. And partly because actually I spend an awful lot of time working on this sort of stuff. So getting the analysis approximately right is, I thought you would say, well done. Now, the facilities that are available by the family planning agencies, of course, should include the right of a woman, given our understanding of when a fetus becomes a person. This is a long-standing debate, but it's not, nobody says it's pre-conception, right? And then maybe not 1 minute conception, so there is room there. I've been involved in this discussion a lot, by the way. But it is contentious, and bear with me for a minute. It's not a question of avoiding it, because if you believe in rights, you do. But on the other hand, I guess, okay, I think I'm moved by the many discussions I've had on these problems, and I say quite a number actually, with people of different belief system. And so I'm somewhat sensitive to see how to guide the discussion through a terrain which is mutually understandable and acceptable. That's the first shot. You are unquestionably right. Quite apart from numbers, here we are talking about women's rights. So I'm with you on that. But I'm not, whether it makes a huge difference to fertility, you may well do so, in which case it really should be on the table. But on the other hand, I have skirted it usually because I really want to find common ground with as many people as possible, because the problems I've been identifying here and a way of thinking about it seems to me to be something that pretty much anybody should accept as a reasonable way of cutting into this dilemma with which I began, which is the mismatch between demand and supply, and the fact that we're doing extremely well. Now, I think that you'll probably think that was a very weak defense, but that's the best I can do.
Okay, where do we go next? There's a lady there in the middle, right at the top. That's you.
Can you all hear me? Just a comment. I'm horrified at hearing abortion described as either murder or the solution. I would say that abortion is simply a failure of contraception and should be viewed in that light. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's just go 2 rows back. There's another hand up there. No, the lady just right behind you.
Hi, my name is Zuhur and I'm 19 years old, and you mentioned how it's up to our generation to solve the environmental issues, but with all the problems going on in the world at the moment, how do you see that the focus on the environment becoming a priority? Because we're met with issues such as we're met with the immediate effects of environmental issues like famines and hurricanes. And how do you see young people becoming more interested and focused and prioritizing environmental issues? Because the effects are in the future. It's not instant. Yeah.
Wow, boy, that's a tough one. Very good one. I wouldn't be hard the way you are being about young people. I wouldn't use words like selfishness, because I don't think that's what's in operation here. What's in operation here is the fact that our activities have consequences which are, at the individual level, very often unintended. And they're unintended, but nevertheless it's happening because of these externalities, the institution failure. We are now, however, just pointed out a few minutes ago, you have access to a technology which can bring collective action far more easily than it used to be at my time. You blog, you have Twitter, you have God knows how many ways of communicating with thousands of people. And if these issues become central, as I hope they will be soon, amongst the young, not saying what the solution is, or not saying we are all greedy and so forth. No, just that we are trashing Earth collectively. What do we do now? What do we say to our MPs or senators or congressmen or whoever? I can't see any other way, because these are global initiatives and they cannot come without pressure. And I've seen the carbon story, the CO2 story, over a 30-year period, and see how gradually it's been built up. The trouble is that it's been very slow, and the data that I have in front, the one I've just shared with you, suggests we shouldn't, it's not one of those things we can say, well, all right, in the next 50 years we'll sort that next one out. It really has to be something that you get policymakers to take seriously, governments to take seriously, because in some sense the engine of action is there. Or if not the federal government, then the states. In the United States at the moment, there are at least 12 states which are behaving in accordance or moving in accordance with Paris, California being the most prime one. And they have the ability to do that, even though the nation doesn't. But it seems to me that's the way to go, because it's it's not melodramatic, because it's a fact. The biosphere is going to be inherited by your children. And if you keep on trashing it, then there's not going to be much of a biosphere for them too. And the consequences are, some of them you have already gleaned from the carbon debate, heat waves and so forth. That's sort of standard now. You can parrot it. But the problems that will occur in 50, 60 years' time if the central pollinators are affected, insects disappear. I don't mean disappearing entirely, but such chunks of the population. Then it bodes really bad for the global agricultural system too. And we don't know where it's going to hit, by the way. Ecology is a very underfunded discipline. So they're very much in ignorance of, they recognize patterns, they certainly understand processes, but quantitatively, and the speed at which things take place, are something which they're not very sure of. I hang out a lot with ecologists, that's why I'm sort of repeating what they've told me, essentially. But it seems to me that's where the young can do it. Don't worry about selfishness and so forth. It's just that we are collectively trashing Earth, and what do we do about it? And the action, I think, should be at the level of local politics to get them and a few of you might even enter politics. And why not?
Okay, if we're very quick, we have time for one more. There's a very insistent hand right at the back, gentleman in the grey jumper. And then we have to stop.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. You mentioned everything was cooked up at the beginning.
Sorry.
So you mentioned at the beginning of the talk everything was cooked up, which made me wonder if this was Cambridge footlights or you actually belong to Cambridge apostles who, while the secret society have included many of the main leading eugenicists in the United Kingdom, including Maynard Keynes, who was the director of the British Eugenics Society for a number of years. So I was wondering how much of eugenics theory and being part of the secret society has influenced your... because all the way through you spoke of just absolute...
Okay.
Actually, none at all. Not one bit. Because at the time I was a member, which was for 2 years, I guess, or 3 years, this is a secret society is just the wrong way of putting it. It's an undergraduate discussion group. I mean, I can speak about it because when you retire, the only reason it was kept secret is that it was so exclusive. Kids wanted to join it. So this was where we are not being lobbied, as it were. It's an intellectual. Russell, Whitehead, Wittgenstein, Ramsay, the whole lot were members. Strachey, Woolf, not Virginia, her husband. They were all members of the Apostle. But the discussions are very functions of the membership. At my time, mostly there were about 3 economists, 2 historians, and a few biologists. And we talked about philosophical problems like scientific method. And of course, when you're very young, 18, 19, or 20, you talk a lot about yourself, your worries and so forth. Ramsay had a very famous essay, which was reproduced some years ago, pretty much immediately after his death, called "Is There Anything to Discuss?" So I don't think eugenics had anything to do with it. I don't really know.
Ramsay was a eugenicist as well.
Beg your pardon?
Ramsay was a eugenicist.
Could be. I just haven't seen any writings on that. I only know his savings paper and his taxation paper. But
it's good to stick to the economics. Let's at that point our time is up. So let me thank Partha both for the talk.